Welcome to a community built of tomorrow's business leaders. Hey guys, I'm William Freitas, and this is the Socius podcast. Socius, welcome back to another episode. Today we've got Claire Stiles from C Legal & Co. Claire, welcome to the show.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
It's so good to have you. We're excited specifically to talk about what it is that your specialty is because I've got a little bias here, so I'm keen to chat about it. But no one introduces yourself better than what you do. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, and where you've come from?
So I am Claire, and I started C Legal & Co. 3 years ago now. I'm originally from the Sunshine Coast, so grew up in the beautiful sunny paradise of Noosa, and parents and the youngest of 4 kids. So they're all still up there. They've got lots of kids, so it's a big, crazy, loud family, which is really lovely. So I do have a satellite office up on the sunny coast. So I do try and go up there as much as I can, and having that balance between Sunshine Coast and Sydney is very nice. Yeah.
And the specialty, you do wills and estates?
Yeah, so specialising in wills and estates from an asset protection lens. So majority of the clients have some sort of complexity to their affairs. So they usually have companies and trusts, superannuation, as well as assets in their personal name. So it's definitely kind of that more complex estate planning piece. And then we also do property. So we have a conveyancing department as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Let's take a step into what had you get into that space, right? Because I can't imagine, look, I'm sure people, jump out of school and they're like, okay, I want to be a lawyer, but why wills and estates? What drew you to that?
Well, I definitely did not go into this career being like, I'm going to be a wills and estates practitioner. So I ended my degree. I did my degree at Bond University on the Gold Coast and went straight to Canada and was a barrister and solicitor in Canada. And so when I was there, my first gig was this very small, old school law firm, 3 white old men, and then me, a 23-year-old Aussie girl, comes walking in with my tan, and they didn't know what to expect. So I started my career in conveyancing. So I ran the conveyancing department of this very small firm for a few years, and that was just great experience. I think conveyancing is a really good place to start as a baby lawyer. And then when I was doing the conveyancing, I didn't want to just be in the property space. So I would be working on commercial transactions and became a very generalist lawyer. And then I wanted to create my own wills and estates clientele. So I started networking the little town that I was in.
Okay.
So that exposed me to some really interesting, complicated wills and estates matters. And that's kind of how I landed myself into, I would say, specialising in that area.
Okay.
Which has been good.
How long were you there before you set up?
So I was about 3 years there, and now I've had 3 years with my company.
Awesome.
And when I started C Legal & Co., I started it actually as a generalist law firm. So I was doing a lot of everything with a main focus on the estate planning piece.
Yeah.
And then as time went on, I realised there was certain work I just wasn't enjoying. And I thought, well, if I've got the stress of running my own business, why am I doing work that I'm not enjoying? And it's just reflective in how you go about the work. And I was like, you know what? They could get serviced somewhere better.
Yeah.
And I can service clients in other areas that I'm truly passionate about.
Super tempting, particularly for a small business or a new business, startup business, to take on any work that comes across their desk, right? And so I imagine like every small business, there's cash flow issues at times. And, what I guess stops you from going, okay, I'll just take on this one commercial transaction. Where do you find yourself? And then, what makes you go, no, I want to focus on this particular area?
So when I usually have this thing at the beginning of the year where I just say, well, from here on in, I'm not doing X, Y, or Z. And so it's kind of like if I say yes to that work, it doesn't align with where I want the business to go. And I have to remind myself of discipline and just saying no.
So take me back to the reset that you said that you undertake at the start of every year.
Yeah.
Is that something you do just in the business, or is that something that applies to, your personal life as well.
Yeah, I do it for both business and personal. And it's not like New Year's resolutions and then 1 month later it's all done and we forget about what our intentions were for the year or our resolutions. I do sit down and I have a really solid way I reflect on the year before from both the business and personal, because I think it's all intertwined. Like if our personal life isn't going well and we're not aligned in our personal life, that's going to filter into our business life, and you can't just compartmentalize things. It all affects everything, especially when you're running a business.
I completely agree. I don't think there's like a work life and a personal life. I think it needs to be intertwined.
Yeah.
So I like that approach. Can you give us an insight into what that process looks like?
Yeah. So I set 5 kind of intentions for both personal and for business. I do a word of the year, which I also love doing because I try to align my decisions with the word of the year. So this year it's really funny. It is discipline, which is very interesting because it's not something that is, sometimes it's a thing that we have to practice to get better at. And sometimes they're decisions that I have to make that I don't really want to be making in the moment, but I know long term they're going to serve me. So I try and set 5 main kind of goals or intentions for both my personal and my business over the year, but also break those down into quarters, because each quarter I like to do a bit of a review and reflect on whether I'm on track or not on track.
So is that like a 5 intentions for the year or 5 goals for the year? Do you then split those 5 into potentially like 10 per 2.25, or how does it work?
No, I try and keep it flowing.
All right.
Otherwise it's too much structure for me.
Yeah.
So it's things like, it might be revenue targets for the business, and then how am I actually going to achieve those revenue targets? So those kind of sub goals under, or the action points per goal. But yeah, it's things like that. And then personal things could be anything. For me, it was really redefining my value system and making every micro decision that I can in alignment to those values. So it's the values, and I tell myself every day, what are my values? What are my top 4 values? They're the same at the moment. And what are the decisions I'm going to make today in line with those values? And it's every little decision. And these books, I've been reading some cool books, and it's the micro decisions that we make that then set us up for success.
Yeah, and I think what I heard when you mentioned you have like this reset at the start of the year is it's subtracting the things that don't serve you, right? So particularly like when you take on a client that may not be a client that aligns with what it is that you, or where you want to go in the business, where it's a commercial transaction in your instance, there's some energy that goes with that, right? And so I really like the idea of reviewing the year and subtracting elements, because I think we overcomplicate everything in life, really. And it's just the idea of simplifying it, really. That's what I like about your approach.
Yeah, I think the more simple you can keep it, the better the results.
And, would you say discipline and simplicity is something that, has been a shining light for your, success in the past, or is there something else? Like, what has led to your success?
I definitely feel like recently the discipline piece is helping me kind of redefine where I want the business to go, what I want it to look like. More simple, less is more kind of approach versus when I started 3 years ago, by reading lots of interesting books, by talking to amazing people, by challenging my thought processes and my, upbringing and all those things that make us who we are. And I think that reset definitely recently has been really, it's identified through the discipline and through thinking, okay, well, if I want to keep things as simple as possible, what does that look like, and how do I sustain and run a business with keeping things simple? Can I achieve the same kind of monetary goals? Is money as important as it once was? So it kind of is a flow-on effect of all of these questions. But some days it's not motivation anymore. It's like some days you don't feel the mojo. Like every Monday, I still have Monday-itis. Like I call my mum on a Monday afternoon and I'm like, it was not an easy day. Like I had to get back into it. And that's still me running a business I love, doing what I love. And you still have that sometimes urges that make you feel like, this is hard. But it's that extra piece of being like, no, just keep going, and you
It's so
can't
funny.
rely on your motivation sometimes.
Well, motivation is temporary, isn't
Yeah.
it? I find motivation is temporary.
Yeah.
And to me, it aligns so well with people that say, oh, you're a business owner, you've got so much time freedom. And it's like, well, not necessarily, because, you know, you might be motivated to hit a certain goal, but at the start of the year, if you set that goal and you're clear to be disciplined, you need to do X, Y, and Z. There's not a whole lot of freedom in that if you want to maintain discipline.
Yeah.
Right? But there's freedom in everything that you choose, that there's some freedom, right? So
Yeah.
it really depends on what choices you decide to take.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I definitely hear is that there's some flexibility in it.
Yes.
You know?
It's a lot of flexibility. I actually think that's the best thing about running a business is it comes back down to how your personal life and business life is completely intertwined. And those that like the work-life balance and what that entails for some people, for me, it's more a integration, like how we integrate work into our life, because I don't live to work. I don't.
And so take me back to what had you start in the Sunshine Coast and want to come down to Sydney. Like what was that like your A-type?
So when I started the business, it was a Sydney-based, but with a Sunshine Coast satellite office. The reason why I wanted to do that was two reasons. One, it got me up to the sunny coast more frequently to see the family, but also I could be working while I'm up there. So it was kind of it was driven by a personal desire to see my family more often. But then I was like, well, how do I make it work with the business? And when I started the business, my brother, he runs a mortgage brokering business on the Sunshine Coast. So he was able to filter me a lot of referrals for conveyancing. So majority of the Sunshine Coast practice is conveyancing. And that also led me to, I've always had a desire to work multi-jurisdictional in a way. So I do Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria property, and then I do my estate planning Australia-wide. So that's a bit of a point of difference, because I've even had lawyers refer me work to do a Queensland conveyance, for instance, because they don't want to do it, or they don't do it and they don't want to take on the risk.
Are there particular differences in legislation across states that make a difference?
Yeah, so every state and territory they all have a different process for a property transaction. In New South Wales, you have to have all your ducks in a row, because when you sign that contract, the only thing you can rely on to get out of that is your cooling off period. And sometimes people waive that, and then it's unconditional. So you can't say this is subject to a building and pest in New South Wales. You have to do all of that before.
So talk to me through, I guess, the percentage. Like what percentage is conveyancing versus estate planning?
So estate planning is probably taking up 70%, and then 30% is conveyancing, I'd say.
And talk to me about estate planning, because I mean, I can only speak personally, and, you know, people in my inner circle. It's not something that's openly spoken about, right? People don't think about death.
They don't want to
regularly.
think about death.
No, they don't want to think about death.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, well, just put my head in the sand, and, you know, if something happens, it happens. But they're almost like, I don't want to manifest this occurring, so we're not going to talk about it. I think this is a really big issue, personally. I mean,
it's a massive issue.
You obviously work in that space.
Yeah.
How do you see that evolving over time? Like, is it an issue right now, or is it just my inner circle?
No, it's an issue. It's an issue. People don't like talking about death. And it is that piece where it requires you to sit down and think about all the what ifs that you don't want to happen. And so I always tell people, well, you're better off having planning for that to arise. So you've sorted everything out and you can sleep at night. Because otherwise, if you don't have anything sorted out, it's an absolute mess.
Yeah,
and I think the stats are 50% of Australians don't have a will. They actually don't have one will. Like, you know what? Even though I'm not advocating for post office wills, sometimes something is better than nothing. But even still, those kind of wills are often overturned. So yeah, people just don't like to talk about it, and it does make it tricky, because it becomes on the bottom of the to-do list, where they're like, they want to do it, they want to complete it, but they're too busy, or they don't really want to sit down and talk about this, depending on where people are at different times of their lives as well.
50%
It's
don't
about that.
have wills.
So it's
That's
about that.
wild. That is crazy. And look, like, obviously, you know, our specialty in my business is insurance, right? But we hear some elements. We hear elements of liability and things that, like, for example, I believe under the Corporations Act, there's like a requirement if a director passes away that someone needs to replace that director within 30. And none of these directors know that.
Yes.
Right? And they're like, well, okay, well, I'm a sole director. If that person passes away, like, do you have a partner? Like, are your parents stepping in? Who's stepping in? Or does that business then just...
Well, who also has the power to appoint that new director if they haven't done any of the documentation?
Yeah.
So then do you have to wait for probate to be appointed? And how long does probate take? 3 to 6 months. So then you're in breach of the Corps Act because there's no director for that period of time.
Yeah, that's
so
crazy.
So you can deal with that by a director's resolution, appointing a succession of the directorship. You can also appoint that within a will. But what I always say is because a will is subject to probate, it's always best to do a resolution.
Some of the listeners might not know what probate is. Do you want to just touch on that real quick?
Probate's the process where you pass away and you've got a will and you have to go to court to receive a seal from the court, and the court will give you that seal. And once you get that seal, you've received probate on that will. And it means that that's the last will of the deceased, and the executor has the right to go and distribute the estate in accordance with the will.
Yeah, and look, we're going to dive into this deep now, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
but
let's dive.
How do you know, like, whether it's obviously the probate is the thing that gives you that solid evidence, right? Because, I've heard of instances where, like, someone's passed away and they said, oh, well, this person referred to me as their second child and they said they would leave X, Y, and Z. Are verbal elements like that taken into consideration?
Yeah, so now we're going into the realm of estate litigation, and the claim for that would be under equity principles, but the evidence they would need, they can't solely just rely on a he said, she said. There needs to be more evidence to actually prove that that intention was actually going to be executed. So they would need something that usually is in writing from the deceased, or if it was some sort of a family discussion, there's another witness involved who can actually confirm, yes, that is what they said. But there's particular requirements to make a claim. So you can challenge a will on two kind of main areas. One is a will challenge against the actual will, which has a different set of categories that you could make a claim. And the other one is family provision, where there's a certain list of claimants who can actually make a claim on the estate saying, I've either not been left enough or you haven't left me anything, and I'm a ex-spouse, current de facto child, grandchild, carer sometimes if they've had a close personal relationship. This class of claimants can make a claim on an estate for family provision, saying you had an obligation to provide for me and you didn't provide for me.
It sounds like the whole space has so much room for litigation.
Yeah, it does.
And I presume this is the main reason for post office wills being a real big issue, right?
There's also big issues with the online will kits as well. So yes, that's a product available to people, and a lot of people use them, but we are going to see a huge increase in litigation with all of these online products now that are in play in about 20 years. Or even 40 years, because that's probably the age category of people who are using online will kits.
I think it's a generational thing, right?
Is.
Like, we see it on the insurance side where people try and buy insurance online. Similar thing with wills, right? Or even commercial contracts, So it'll be interesting to see how things develop, I guess. But you said around about 50% of people don't have wills in Australia. I'd be really interested to know the percentage of business owners that don't have wills. A large portion of our audience are business owners. And so, I would be really interested to find that out. I'm not going to ask you for that stat because you're probably not aware of it. But do you see that as an issue with business owners? Like, how many business owners do you work with? What sort of percentage split do you work with?
Majority of my clients are business owners or high net worth couples. So they've got the assets to kind of warrant a testamentary trust will, which is all the wills that I do. So they're the more complicated structures. But I would say of the 70% of the estate planning work, I would say 60% of clients are business owners. That's the space we work in, because business assets don't form part of your estate. So someone might have a will, but all their assets may be in a business. So how do you have succession within the business? Is you build in succession. You build it in with the constitution, you build it in through resolutions. The shares can pass under a will, and then anything in the personal name forms part of your estate. And then you've got ways and structures within a will that you can have asset protection and tax minimisation if you draft those documents correctly. I think a lot of the times people are so focused on building their wealth, but they're not focused on, well, I'm building all this wealth, why am I doing it, number one? And a lot of the times it does come down to, I want to, create security for my family, but there's just no good if you don't have that actually secured by a proper estate plan. So I think it comes down to value systems. And if people don't really value it, they're not going to come and see me. If they don't value what service we're providing and understanding the risks to their estate and their business, they are going to be the ones that go off and get something that's potentially unenforceable.
I find, like you said, most people are really focused on building their career, building their business, building their wealth, and they don't really think about what could happen. And in Australia particularly, I feel like the grass is always green over here, and it's never going to happen to me.
Sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. And at some point it does, and when it does, no one hears about it, so then no one knows about it. But when it does, when they're not prepared for it, it's a real big issue, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the number of times I've gone to hospital and having to implement things on a very emergency-based scenario.
Bedside, you would do that.
Bedside. So that's the risk if people wait too late and they no longer have capacity, then they can't actually draft a valid will.
So I'm getting my head around this. So you would go into a hospital potentially with a neuro doctor to determine capacity. Yeah?
Yeah.
And then at that point you can actually write a will.
At that point I can get instructions from the client.
And then probate might take a bit of time.
So then what would happen is, and there's been a time where I've gone to hospital with the computer and we've drafted it there and then printed it off, had the nurse be the second witness, sign it. A couple of weeks later, person passed away. That will was valid.
Wow.
And that will got probated and the estate was distributed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost morbid to talk about, right?
It is. We don't like talking about it. And that comes back to your point of, is this an Australian cultural thing? Is this a generational thing? My big piece is I want to educate people in this space to talk about it. I speak to my clients in quite a humorous way. I'm like, at the end of the day, we are all going to die. Like, why can't we talk about it? Let's talk about it. And let's hope it's not tomorrow. Let's hope we have a long life, but not every day is guaranteed. So, bringing a different kind of approach to it so that it's like, okay, well, we're doing this to protect your family. And I always encourage my clients that have healthy relationships within the family to all be aware of the estate plan as well.
So how do you plan on educating people? Is that on a one-to-one basis with clients or?
No, I think it's just more like presence. Like, I'm trying to get a lot of content out on LinkedIn. I'm trying in my networks. I'm starting to offer webinars for people that run accountant firms, financial services, your kinds of companies, where I educate the team. Because if I can educate the team, then that filters through to the clients. So that's my latest and greatest thing that I want to be able to spread the word about, I guess, educating people in estate planning. Because the more that we know, the more we can impart with our clients on just like an everyday conversation, like, oh, this is the update, this is what's been happening, have you thought about this? As opposed to it being like, let's sit down and talk about death. It's like, oh, so grateful for this life, isn't it a nice day? And then it kind of leads into a softer way of bringing it all up.
And look, it makes sense for us to work together, particularly we talk about business risks with our clients all the time. So this is a key business risk, absolutely. Losing a partner or losing the director.
Absolutely right, yeah.
I like that. Talk to me about your vision. Your vision for the business and likely for the industry, right?
Yeah.
Because it does seem like an industry where there could be so much more focus on people utilizing getting professional wills and some professional legal advice.
Yeah.
What's your vision for the future?
I think the vision is being able to have conversations with people in the space that realise the value of a proper estate plan. And that's only going to come through conversation. And the more that we talk about it, the less morbid it may feel. So I think that's kind of the vision for me and the firm. I run a boutique firm. I have a team of 3. It's not a big team. I don't intend for it to be a big team. I like the boutique offering that we get. There's more and more lawyers out there that are doing it this way. And I do really think there's a lot of business owners that value that boutique approach, and they're really getting serviced very well. The communication piece, I would say, is where the great feedback that we've had is we just like that you keep us in the loop. And if in the loop means I've got no news for you, that's in the loop, versus we have to go through 3, a receptionist and 2 paralegals to speak to the lawyer. There's quite a difference in that approach versus how we approach things.
And do you think the industry will follow suit? You're already saying that some are, but what's your view on, I guess, and without throwing anyone under the bus here, but the large internationals or the big law firms, how do they do it? Because obviously, absolutely, you're right. Like every business model I've seen, when you have to go through the receptionist and the assistant, and you get charged for the 20 minutes that you're waiting
that's right.
before you speak to the solicitor. It isn't centered around the customer.
No.
It's not. And I appreciate that they're built around building some efficiencies for the solicitor so they can focus on, key high thinking and high valuable tasks. But it isn't servicing clients well enough. So do you think the industry will follow suit? What will that look like?
I think it will be interesting. There'll always be a space for the big top tier because of the kinds of industries that engage with them. But I think where a big shift is happening is in the fee structures. And there's a lot of commentary, a lot of lawyers talking about this, where as much as possible, people are trying to do fixed fee models and give certainty as to costs, because the billable hour is archaic and really, in my view, shouldn't really be used. And how we could get away from the billable hour and what would that look like for the future of law, and how would that then create more of a productization of the legal services versus the billable hour, where you are getting billed per minute or 6 minutes.
And I can imagine that would have a dramatic impact on the, satisfaction of every employee, every solicitor working in that space as well.
I think so. Honestly, tracking time is so mundane and tedious. I don't know one lawyer that likes it, but...
Yeah, that'd be a real challenge.
Yeah.
Claire, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. I think it's super valuable to talk about wills and estates. I've never had to say wills and estates more in a podcast. It's like I'm saying my name every now and then.
That's right.
But thank you for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. Where can people find you on socials?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. And the best place to find us is LinkedIn and Instagram. That's the 2 main platforms. We have a website, and then if anyone wants to get in touch, an email or my phone number is everywhere. So
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Everybody,
you.
Claire Stiles from C Legal & Co. Socius, thank you for joining us today. Please hit the subscribe button if you've enjoyed this episode. And if you'd like to be part of the Socius community, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn to stay in touch. Cheers.